Kevin for the introduction, and no pressure, but hopefully this will be another message, and hopefully God will speak to us through his word this morning. That's the important thing, really. And so we're going to look at John chapter 9. You've seen a summary of it in the video we just saw. I like those settled-back videos. They're quite true to the text mostly, and they give you a good atmosphere of what the occasion must have been like. But we're going to take time to read the whole chapter, John chapter 9. I'm going to read from the New International Version. This is one of the most interesting and detailed, and to my mind, one of the funniest stories in the Gospels. I find it really amusing the way that the Pharisees get increasingly agitated to the point of personal abuse at both Jesus and the man, and the way the healed man becomes increasingly agitated and annoyed and frustrated by the Pharisees' unwillingness to see what's in front of their eyes. And so we'll read the whole story, the whole chapter from John chapter 9, if you have it on your device or on your book in front of you. It'll probably be on the screen as well. And as we read through it, think about these two questions. What can we see and what can we know? What can we see and what can we know? John chapter 9. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" There's a bit of a buzz coming from somewhere, Andrew. Do we know where it is? It's maybe the speaker here, is it? Sorry to interrupt. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it's day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who'd formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then he turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." They still did not believe that he'd been blind and had received his sight until he sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" he asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he's our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. If he's of age, he'll speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who'd been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man's a sinner." He replied, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody's ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out. And when they found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. Jesus said, for judgment I've come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, and they asked, what? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. What a wonderful, profound story. And there's so much of this story that we can dig out. The whole concept of seeing and knowing. It's a very carefully constructed story, and as I say, I think it's quite funny the way the Pharisees get so agitated, and the man gains in confidence, so he's able to answer them back. The question of seeing, both physical and spiritual seeing, pervades the whole story. Jesus saw the man. The man went and washed and came seeing. The Pharisees can't see who Jesus is, and so Jesus says they remain blind. Jesus is at the beginning and at the end of the story. At the beginning of the story, he declares that he is the light of the world in verse 5. And we saw him say that a few weeks ago when we were looking at chapter 8. Remember, Jesus says there, I am the light of the world. And we were thinking about how in that chapter, Jesus is a light for guidance and for warning. He guides you and he warns you by showing light. And in this chapter here, the light brings relief from blindness, both physical and spiritual blindness. Jesus is the light of the world. And relief from blindness is one of Jesus' mission statements, if you like. Remember back in Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, when Jesus preaches his first recorded sermon in the synagogue at Capernaum, he quotes from the book of Isaiah, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus is quoting from the book of Isaiah that he's come to recover sight for the blind. This is one of the big themes of Isaiah's prophecy. As you go through the prophecy of Isaiah, there are a number of occasions where Isaiah talks about relief from blindness. In Isaiah 29, verse 18, in the context of the Lord Almighty coming, he says, in that day the deaf will hear the words of the scroll, and out of gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind will see. A bit later on in Isaiah, in the context of God coming to his people, Isaiah says, then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. In Isaiah 42, as God's servant is announced and given a mission to go and bring God's good news to the people, Isaiah 42 verse 6 says this, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. And so Jesus is quoting from the prophecy of Isaiah, and Isaiah is saying that when Messiah comes, when God comes to his people to bring his message, there will be relief from blindness, both physical and spiritual. And so Jesus coming as the light of the world is fulfilling the prophecies from Isaiah about relief from blindness coming in. So that's at the beginning of the story. At the end of the story, Jesus reveals himself to the healed man as the Son of Man. And as we'll think in a minute, that is also a title that he is the Messiah. He is one whom God has sent to bring good news and relief from blindness to the world. As I looked at this story, it struck me it's almost like a play. So it's a play with a prologue, the dialogue between Jesus and his disciples and the healing of the blind man. And then in verses 8 to 12, you have Act 1, which is the dialogue with the neighbors. 13 to 34, we have Act 2, is the dialogue with the Pharisees. And 35 to 41, we have dialogue between Jesus and the healed man, and incidentally some Pharisees standing by as well. So we'll look at the prologue to this drama, first of all. And it begins with a profound theological question. Jesus sees the man. The disciples see the problem. Why is this man blind, they ask Jesus. Is it because he sinned or because his parents sinned? And they're reflecting a common idea, common theological conception at the time. And we see that a little bit later as the Pharisees accuse the man of being steeped in sin from birth. The idea that if there's something wrong, if you're ill or disabled, it's because of some specific sin that you've committed. And that's something that's translated into our culture a bit as well. People have this idea, you maybe have the phrase, it's karma. And that's an idea that comes from some of the Indian religions. The idea that if something goes wrong, then it's probably your fault, particularly looking at somebody else. If something's gone wrong with somebody, it's probably their fault. It's probably something they've done to bring misfortune on themselves. It's karma. And that's a faulty theological concept which Jesus knocks on the head straight away. We need to think about this and take a little bit of time to unpack it a bit. Because there's this idea that if you're well and prosperous, then God's blessing must be on you, and it's probably a reward for good behavior. But if you are suffering from illness or misfortune, then it must be because of something that you've done somewhere along the line. And this is a completely faulty theology, as Jesus points out to the people. Sometimes Christians have been quite damaged by this idea. And sometimes people have come for prayer for healing. They haven't been healed. And so they're left with the idea that it's probably because of some unconfessed sin or some fault of mine. I haven't had enough faith that I haven't been healed. Jesus is clear that illness or disability and sin is not a direct cause and effect. As the scientists would say, correlation is not the same as causation. So because there's illness or disability, it doesn't mean that it's directly because of a particular sin. Certainly, sin, the Bible is clear, has brought disease and death into the world. In the book of Romans, Paul unpacks that quite a lot and sums it up in Romans 5, verse 12, where he says, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned." And sometimes specific sins do have consequences for people's health. In the Old Testament, in the book of Numbers, there's a story of Miriam, Moses' sister, who rebelled against Moses and against God's leading of the people and was struck down with leprosy as a result. She was then healed. Sometimes specific sins have consequences, not just for the original sinner, but for those connected with them as well. Think of the story of David and his adultery with Bathsheba and with his manslaughter of Bathsheba's husband. And because of that sin, the baby that was born as a consequence became ill and died. So sometimes specific sins do have consequences. In the New Testament, we read in 1 Corinthians 11 of some people who have committed the sin of disrespecting and disregarding their fellow believers, particularly in the context of communion. They're not showing love and care to their fellow believers. And Paul says, because of this, some of you have become ill and some have even died. That's a scary thought. In James chapter 5, where James gives instructions about how sick people can ask the elders to pray for them and anoint them for healing, James says, the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. If they have sinned. So James can conceive the possibility it might be some sin involved. And so sometimes sin does cause problems directly. But by no means all illness and misfortune is caused directly by sin. The Bible is quite clear about that. Think about the book of Job, for instance. That's one of the classic texts in the Old Testament where a righteous man, Job, who is declared at the beginning, at the end of the book, to be a righteous man, suffers terribly, both in his possessions, in his family, and in his own health. And there's really no explanation given as to why Job suffers. But Job is a righteous man who suffers, not because of his sin, but just because that happens. In Psalm 73, the psalmist gets quite agitated by the idea that the wicked are prosperous and healthy. Why should these wicked people continue to be prosperous and healthy? Surely they should be punished for their sins. But no, it doesn't happen. In the New Testament, we see that both Paul and his protege Timothy suffer from ill health. And these are some of the most righteous people around at the time. And so it's really important to say that sin and illness, disability, misfortune are not always directly linked, although they sometimes might be. And many believers have been burdened by the thought that their misfortune is all their fault. And if only they can find out some forgotten sin or something that they haven't confessed yet, then it'll be sorted out. Jesus says that this man is suffering from his disability so that the works of God may be displayed in him. Now that in itself is a difficult concept. Does that mean that God deliberately made the man blind so that Jesus could come along and heal him? Surely not. But often our misfortunes, however unwanted, will bring us closer to God. Often our misfortunes and our response to them through God's grace will be a witness to other people of how God works in our lives. We sang a couple of songs there. Through the deepest valley, he will lead. And as God leads us through deep valleys, if that's a valley of misfortune, ill health, relationship breakdown, economic problems, whatever it may be, God can lead us through these deep valleys. And so God can display his works in our lives through the most difficult misfortune. We sang that song, Blessed Be Your Name. We sang that song at my wife's funeral. And we sung it again at Hannah's wedding. And through the good times and the bad times of life, God can lead us and guide us. And so the gracious input of Jesus is clear here. He takes the initiative and steps into this man's misfortune. God can display his works through the difficult and dangerous and depressing times in our lives. And Jesus steps in without any prompting by the man here. There's no recorded request or faith initiative by this man. You contrast that with the blind man called Bartimaeus, who Mark tells us about, and he makes a big fuss and shouts and tells Jesus, I want to get healed. Quick, come and heal me. This particular man just seems to be passive, but Jesus takes the initiative and steps in and heals him. God steps in, unrequested almost, and heals the man. But the man had to go. Jesus puts the mud on his eyes, and that's a strange thing. What do you think about that? All sorts of people have had thoughts and ideas about that. John doesn't explain why Jesus did it that way. Jesus heals people in all sorts of ways. Sometimes he touches them. Sometimes he heals them at a distance. Sometimes he just says a word. In this case, he makes some mud with the saliva, puts it on the man's eyes, and he says to him, right, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he sends the man to go and play his part in his healing. Now, that may not have been easy for the man. He didn't have a guide dog. He didn't even have a white stick. Did he know where the pool of Siloam was? Maybe he had to get somebody to guide him and help him along the way to the pool. But the man did it. He responded, he went, he washed, and he came seeing. Isn't that a wonderful little phrase? The man went and washed and came home seeing. And so Jesus takes the initiative. The man does his part in responding. God steps in to our lives, but we have to respond to his commands for the faith to be at work. So that's the prologue. Act 1 is the dialogue with the neighbours. Quite a short act, really. And these neighbours can't believe the evidence of their own eyes. Somebody born blind who now can see can't be real. We have to think of an alternative explanation. There's a conspiracy going on here. It's somebody else. It's a ringer. Maybe he's got a twin brother that we don't know about, and it's him, really. They try to provide an alternative, rational explanation for why this man can now see. But the previously blind man tells simply what happened. It is me, he says. I am the man. How could this have happened? How were your eyes open? He says, well, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. The evidence is there in front of them, if they only want to accept it and believe it. At this stage, the man didn't understand how or why it's happened. He's almost as baffled as they are, but he knows it's happened. They're being skeptical. There's no rational explanation. But the man is quite insistent in his testimony. So the people understandably look for a spiritual explanation. And so that leads us into Act 2 of the drama. They take the man to the Pharisees to see what the religious opinion is going to be about this miraculous healing. Now, the Pharisees, we've come across them before numerous times. They were the religious experts of the day, the enthusiasts. They should have been the good guys, really. They were people who studied the Tanakh, the Old Testament that we know about, and particularly the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, God's laws. But they also added elaborate traditions and rules and explanations to these laws to enforce obedience. Their idea was that by obeying God's word very literally, they would bring back the nation to God, and so bring God's blessing on the nation, and hopefully get rid of these oppressive Romans who were occupying the country. And so to the rules and the laws in the Torah, in the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, as we sometimes call it, they added all sorts of additional rules. And so there's an instruction in the Old Testament that you should give a tithe of your earnings. You give 10% of your earnings to God's work. And they says, oh, well, if you go out and pick some herbs from your garden to flavor your food, you should give 10% of that as well. And Jesus picks them up on that. To being pernickety in the extreme. And they have lots of rules, particularly around Sabbath observance. The simple rule is that you don't work on the Sabbath. And that's fairly straightforward. But they said, well, how do we define work? So they had a big long list of things that you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And particularly, one of the things that's included is that you can't knead dough. So if you're making some dough, if you're making some bread, you can't knead it on the Sabbath day. And you can't heal non-urgent cases on the Sabbath day. So if somebody's dying, somebody's bleeding to death, you can stop the bleeding. But somebody who's been blind since birth, that's not an urgent case, so you can wait till the next day to heal them. And so the Pharisees are picking on these traditions, these rules, and it's blinding them to the truth that's in front of their eyes. Now, they knew the Old Testament scriptures as we know them very well. They knew the prophets. They must have known the book of Isaiah. They probably knew it off by heart. And so they should have picked up on the idea that here we have miraculous healing of blind people. Maybe this is God coming and starting to work. But they were so blinded by their own traditions, by their own ideas, that they just didn't want to see it. In Isaiah talks about the Sabbath, about fasting in Isaiah 58. And he says it should be about peace and justice, not about observing rules. But these people, these Pharisees, were completely blinded to what was going on in front of their eyes. Healing the blind should have been a hint that something special was going on, that maybe here is Messiah coming. And the previously blind man understands this, in fact, better than these religious experts. They bring the parents in. And the parents are afraid to cause trouble. They don't want to get in trouble with these Pharisees, these big pompous people with their robes, sitting up in front of them in judgment. They may be excluded from the synagogue, which doesn't just mean that you can't go to church on Sunday. It means you're excluded from all the religious and social life of the community. They don't want to get involved, basically. So they say, well, ask him. He'll tell you the story. And the Pharisees, I think quite amusingly, become increasingly angry and irrational. They descend to personal attacks. They call Jesus this fellow. They attack the healed man. They throw insults at him. Did you notice that? They start to insult him. And they tell him that he's steeped in sin at birth. They're reverting to that original retributive worldview. Because you're a blind man at birth, then you must be a sinner. And they're holding themselves up above this man, despite the fact that they can't see what's going on. The healed man himself has a gradual development of faith from the evidence in front of him. What do you think of Jesus? They said to him. Well, he must be a prophet, he says at first. Then he says, well, I want to be his disciple. I want to follow him. And then he talks about Jesus as being a godly person, someone from God. His understanding is gradually developing, although he doesn't really know very much about Jesus yet. The Pharisees then expel him, presumably excommunicating him from the synagogue, as they threatened to do. And that leads us into Act 3, where there's the climax and the resolution. And again, Jesus takes the initiative. Jesus comes and finds the man to explain to him what's going on as to why he's been healed. We've seen Jesus do this before, back in chapter 5, when he heals a paralyzed man and then comes and finds him to explain what's going on. And here Jesus takes the initiative. He challenges the man to belief and response. Do you believe in the Son of Man? He says to the man. Son of Man is a title that is given to Jesus throughout the Gospels, particularly in John's Gospel, to emphasize the fact that he is Messiah. He's the one sent from God. And in John particularly, it speaks about the revelation of God to humanity. So Jesus is the one who's come as Messiah, as God's messenger, to explain to everybody who God is and what he wants from people. And the Son of Man is also spoken about in John's Gospel as being the final judge of humanity. He's the one who's going to judge everybody at the end of time. We see that in John chapter 5. And in Jesus, as he talks about that in verse 39, for judgment I've come into this world. So Jesus says to the man, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he's a bit puzzled. He says, well, who are you talking about? Who is this Son of Man? And Jesus says, you've now seen him. And of course, this is the first time the man has physically seen Jesus. His previous encounter with Jesus, he was blind, couldn't see him. But now he sees him both physically and spiritually. He sees him physically, but spiritually he also understands who Jesus is. He's the Son of Man, and he responds with faith and worship. He still has a lot to learn and understand, but he's willing to trust Jesus, this one who's turned his life around. What a contrast with the Pharisees and this little coda at the end, where the Pharisees, despite all the evidence, remain deliberately blind to the truth. So there's the story. And what's it got to do with us 2,000 years later? A few comments and questions for us. Firstly, again, it's important to emphasize that not all our problems are due directly to sin. Some of them may be. But sometimes bad things happen to good people, as in the book of Job. But in all our problems of life, God can bring blessing to us. Just as Jesus promised this blind man that God was going to work in him. God can bring blessing to us if we're willing to trust and obey God. The problems may not go away, but through the darkest valley, he will lead, as we sung earlier. Secondly, are we willing to be obedient when God calls us or sends us despite the difficulties? Jesus sends the man, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. If he hadn't done that, he would have remained blind. But despite all the difficulties and the obstacles, the man is obedient. He goes and does what he's told. He washes in the pool and knows God's blessing as a result. Are we willing to be obedient when God calls us or sends us, despite the difficulties and obstacles that may be there? If we are, then we can know God's blessing in our life. Thirdly, what is our response going to be to the Son of Man, to Jesus, God's Messiah, the one who's been sent by God to humanity? Are we going to be like the neighbors, skeptical, looking for a rational explanation, not willing to respond in faith? Are we going to be like the man's parents, afraid of the social pressures that may come if we acknowledge who Jesus is? Are we going to be like the Pharisees, blinded by our own prejudices and traditions to the truth of Jesus? By contrast, the blind man, with his developing vision, physically and spiritually, responds to Jesus with faith and worship. What is our response going to be this morning? And finally, how willing are we going to be to tell people our story? Once I was blind, and now I can see. It's a very simple story. There's no theological profundity there. You don't need to be a philosopher or a theologian to tell people what God has done for you. Are you willing to, like this blind man, just stick to your story? Once I was blind, but now I can see. And that's one of the most profound things that we can do as we try and tell people, spread the good news about Jesus, the one who's come to spread God's news, God's blessing, God's power, God's healing to the world. May God help us and strengthen us to respond to him this week. Thank you.